We used to eat ramen in a leaky apartment, dreaming of the day he'd buy me the Star of Chicago diamond. 20 years later, he finally bought it, but for a woman he'd known for 6 months, using the very capital I worked 80-hour weeks to save. He called me a failure as a wife, while I was secretly holding the diagnosis that could save his life. I decided then, he doesn't deserve my mercy. Let me tell you how it all began. The air in our Malibu penthouse was thick, not with the scent of the expensive lilies I'd arranged on the mahogany table, but with a silence so heavy it felt like it was crushing the breath right out of my lungs. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the Pacific waves crash against the shore in the twilight, my fingers trembling as they brushed against the envelope hidden in my silk robe. Inside that envelope was a death sentence, not for me, but for Julian. The doctor's voice was still echoing in my mind, explaining the cold, clinical reality of ALS, telling me that the man I'd spent a decade building a life with was about to lose his ability to move, to speak, to breathe. I had spent the entire afternoon in a state of shattered grace, trying to figure out how to tell him that our world was about to end, yet somehow promising myself I would be the pillar he leaned on until his very last breath. Then the front door clicked open. Julian didn't walk in with flowers or an apology for being late to our 10th anniversary dinner. He walked in with the stride of a man who thought he owned the sun, his eyes cold and distant, already looking past me as if I were a piece of outdated furniture in my own home. He didn't notice the vintage wine I'd uncorked, or the soft glow of the candles. He simply reached into his briefcase and tossed a thick folder onto the marble countertop. The sound of it hitting the stone was like a gunshot in the quiet room. "Don't bother with the dinner, Clara," he said, his voice devoid of any warmth we had shared over 1,000 shared meals. "I'm done. I want a divorce, and I want it settled by the end of the week." I stared at him, my heart performing a slow, agonizing crawl into my throat. I looked at the man who had once promised to protect me, the man I had helped elevate from a struggling designer to a real estate mogul through my own architectural genius and 80-hour work weeks. He looked back at me with nothing but boredom. "A divorce?" I whispered, the weight of the medical report in my pocket feeling like a hot coal against my hip. "Julian, it's our anniversary. We built this together. We were supposed to be a team." He let out a sharp, mocking laugh that cut deeper than any blade. "Team? Clara, look at yourself. You're efficient, sure. You're a great business partner. But as a wife? You're as exciting as a blueprint. You've become clinical, dry, and frankly, I'm tired of playing the part of the devoted husband to a woman who cares more about structural integrity than passion." He stepped closer, his face twisting into a mask of smug arrogance. "I found Tiffany. She's everything you aren't. Young, vibrant, and she actually makes me feel alive. She doesn't talk about capital or investments every morning. She just sees me." The irony was a bitter pill I had to swallow in silence. He felt alive, while his own motor neurons were already beginning to die. He was trading a decade of loyalty for a 6-month thrill, fueled by the very wealth I had secured for us through my sacrifices. I thought of the early days in Chicago, the leaky ceiling, and the way we'd share a single bowl of ramen while dreaming of the Star of Chicago diamond he promised would one day sit on my finger. He had bought that diamond today. I saw the receipt in his open briefcase. Millions of dollars of our joint capital, spent on a trophy for a girl who wouldn't know how to spell sacrifice if it were written in her own lipstick. He was leaving me with the house and the assets, thinking he was being generous by walking away with his freedom and his new muse, completely unaware that his body was already betraying him. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the flicker of a tremor in his right hand as he reached for a glass of water. It was the first sign. In a few months, he wouldn't be able to hold that glass. In a year, he wouldn't be able to walk. He was throwing me away right when I was the only person on this earth who would have stayed by his side through the hell that was coming. A wave of cold, crystalline clarity washed over me. The sorrow vanished, replaced by a steel-hard resolve. He wanted to be free? I would give him exactly what he asked for. I reached out, picked up the pen he'd left on the counter, and signed the papers without a single tear. I didn't tell him about the diagnosis. I didn't tell him that the man he thought he was becoming, the invincible tycoon with the young bride, was already a ghost. "I hope she's worth it, Julian," I said, my voice as steady as the foundations of the buildings I designed. I tucked the medical report deeper into my pocket, a secret weapon I would never use to save him now. "I hope you don't regret this." He just smirked, grabbed his briefcase, and walked out the door without a backward glance, leaving me alone in the penthouse we'd built on my sweat and his lies. I sat there in the dark, watching the man I loved walk away into a disaster he couldn't see. If you've ever felt the sting of a 10-year betrayal, hit like and tell me where you're listening from. I need to know I'm not alone in this storm. The silence that Julian left behind wasn't just empty, it was loud, echoing with the ghosts of the 1,000 promises we had whispered to each other, in much humbler rooms than this. As I sat there, the cold ocean breeze filtering through the open balcony, my mind drifted back, far away from the polished marble of Malibu, to the gritty, wind-swept streets of Chicago. 10 years ago, we didn't have a penthouse. We didn't even have a bedroom door that closed properly. We had a third-floor walk-up in a building that smelled permanently of old radiator fluid and wet wool. Every time it rained, the ceiling in the kitchen would weep, a steady drip, drip, drip into a plastic bucket we'd found in the alley. But back then, the sound of that dripping water didn't feel like a burden. It was just the rhythm of our struggle, the soundtrack to our shared American dream. I can still see Julian sitting at that rickety wooden table, his fingers stained with ink, and his eyes bloodshot from staring at blueprints. We were so broke that our celebratory dinners consisted of a single pack of spicy ramen, split between 2 cracked ceramic bowls. I'd always give him the extra broth because he was the one out there, pounding the pavement, trying to sell our visions to developers who didn't want to listen to a couple of kids with nothing but a portfolio. He'd look at me, his face gaunt but his eyes burning with a fire I thought would never go out, and he'd take my hand, the hand that was usually cramped from doing the actual structural calculations for the designs he pitched. "One day, Clara," he'd whisper, the steam from the noodles rising between us like a prayer, "I'm going to buy you the Star of Chicago. I'm going to put a diamond on your finger so bright, it'll make the Sears Tower look like a candle. We're going to be the kings of this city." I believed him. Not because I cared about the diamond, but because I believed in us. What Julian never realized, or perhaps what he chose to forget as the zeros in our bank account grew, was that I wasn't just his wife. I was his foundation. While he was the face of the firm, the charismatic man who could charm a billionaire into signing a contract, I was the one in the shadows, fixing the impossible angles and making sure his artistic visions didn't collapse under their own weight. I worked 80-hour weeks, fueled by cheap coffee and the desperate hope that we were building something permanent. I was the one who stayed up until 3 in the morning, redrawing the load-bearing walls for the Crescent Heights project, when Julian had already fallen asleep. I did it gladly. I thought every late night was a brick laid in the temple of our future. I thought my sacrifice was a down payment on a lifetime of loyalty. I was building an empire, but I didn't realize I was also building a pedestal so high that Julian would eventually feel entitled to look down on me from it. The transition from us against the world to Julian against me happened so slowly I almost missed it. It started with the small things. The way he stopped asking for my opinion on the final drafts. The way he'd suddenly changed the password to his laptop for security reasons. Or the business trips to Vegas that lasted 2 days longer than they should have. He started caring more about the brand of his suits than the integrity of our builds. He grew obsessed with his image, with the way the world saw him. And somewhere along the line, the we became I. He'd stand at gala events, holding a glass of champagne that cost more than our first month's rent, and tell reporters about his inspiration and his hard work. I'd stand by his side, smiling, playing the role of the supportive, quiet wife, while the calculations for his next masterpiece were still burning behind my eyes. I thought he was just caught up in the whirlwind of success. I thought he'd come back to me once the dust settled. But success doesn't change people, it unmasks them. As our wealth increased, so did his arrogance. He began to treat my contributions as a given, a background noise he no longer felt the need to acknowledge. He'd mock my obsession with the details, calling me clinical or uninspired whenever I pointed out a flaw in his logic. The man who used to share his last noodle with me now looked at me as if I were a line item in his budget that he wanted to trim. He forgot the cold Chicago winters. He forgot the leaky ceiling. He forgot that without my mind, he was just a man with a pretty sketch and no ground to stand on. And now, he had taken the very capital I had bled for, the money we had saved by living on nothing for years, and he had used it to buy that star of Chicago. But it wasn't for the woman who sat in the rain with him. It was for a girl who liked the way the light hit the facets, a girl who didn't know the cost of a single spark of that stone. Standing there in the Malibu dark, I realized that the dream we had built was nothing but a beautiful facade with a rotten core. Julian was moving on, thinking he was trading an old model for a newer, shinier one, completely oblivious to the fact that he was walking away from the only person who knew how to keep his world from crumbling. He thought he was the architect of his own destiny, but he had forgotten who drew the maps. My heart, once warm with the memory of Chicago, turned to ice. I wasn't going to cry for the man who promised me a diamond and gave me a betrayal. I was going to let him have his freedom, his mistress, and his shiny new ring. And I was going to watch from the sidelines as the structural integrity of his life began to fail, one tremor at a time. 2 weeks later, the night of the J&C Architecture 10th Anniversary Gala arrived. The very event I had spent 6 months meticulously planning, down to the exact thread count of the silk linens and the specific warmth of the amber lighting. This wasn't just a party. It was a celebration of a decade of professional excellence. It was supposed to be our night, the night the industry acknowledged the powerhouse duo that had reshaped the California coastline. I arrived early, dressed in a charcoal gray tailored suit that shouted authority rather than gala glamour. I was there to work, to ensure every guest felt the weight of our success. But as I walked through the ballroom of the Beverly Wilshire, checking the floral arrangements and the acoustics of the stage, I felt like a ghost haunting my own funeral. I was the architect who had built the cathedral, standing in the shadows while the congregation waited for a different priest. The room was a sea of black ties and designer gowns, the crème de la crème of West Coast real estate. I moved through the crowd, accepting polite nods and professional handshakes, but I could feel the whispers following me like a cold draft. In these circles, news of a split travels faster than a market crash. Then, the double doors at the main entrance swung open, and the room went deathly silent for a fraction of a second before the murmurs exploded. Julian walked in, looking every bit the triumphant conqueror, but he wasn't alone. Clinging to his arm like a bright, blood-red stain on my perfect canvas was Tiffany. She was wearing a dress that left very little to the imagination, a sharp contrast to the sophisticated elegance I had cultivated for the firm's image. But the dress wasn't what stopped my heart. It was the light reflecting off her left hand. There it was, the star of Chicago, the diamond that was supposed to be the symbol of our shared struggle, the reward for those ramen noodle nights in the freezing cold of Illinois. Seeing it on her finger, as she giggled and tucked a lock of blonde hair behind her ear, felt like a physical blow to my solar plexus. He hadn't just replaced me, he had gifted her my history. He had taken the trophy of my 10-year marathon and handed it to a girl who had barely finished the warm-up. Julian didn't even look for me. He led her straight to the VIP table, my table, and pulled out the chair I was meant to occupy. He was parading his betrayal in the very house I had built, using the anniversary of my hard work as the stage for my public execution. Clara, darling, you look busy, a voice drawled behind me. I turned to see Eleanor, one of our biggest investors, and a woman who smelled of old money and judgment. She glanced toward the head table where Tiffany was currently sipping champagne and laughing a little too loudly. Awkward timing for a rebranding, wouldn't you say? The sting in her words was intentional. In their eyes, I wasn't the brilliant mind who made Julian's sketches viable. I was the discarded wife, the one who had failed to remain interesting enough to keep the man at the helm. I felt the urge to scream, to tell them that the man they were toasting was a man who couldn't even remember to check the load-bearing specs without me. I wanted to tell Eleanor that Tiffany didn't know the difference between a cantilever and a coat hanger. But I didn't. I simply took a sip of my sparkling water and smiled, a cold, professional mask that felt like it was made of stone. The peak of the humiliation came when Julian took the stage for the keynote speech. He stood behind the podium I had helped design, under the spotlight I had positioned to make him look heroic. 10 years, he began, his voice booming with a false sense of humility. They say behind every great man is a great woman. He paused, and for a split second, the room turned toward me. My heart hammered against my ribs. Was he going to acknowledge me? Was there a shred of the boy from Chicago left in him? Then, he looked directly at Tiffany, who was beaming at him from the front row. And I am so lucky to have found the woman who truly inspires my next chapter. Tiffany, thank you for showing me what it means to be alive again. The applause was deafening, but to me, it sounded like the crumbling of a skyscraper. He hadn't just ignored my decade of labor, he had erased it. He had rewritten the history of J&C architecture to make it seem as though I were merely a placeholder until his true inspiration arrived. I stood in the back of the room, watching Tiffany touch the Star of Chicago diamond as she blew him a kiss. It was a calculated, cruel erasure of my identity. I looked at the investors, the peers, the friends who were now lining up to congratulate the happy couple, and I realized that my loyalty had earned me nothing but a front-row seat to my own replacement. But as the rage began to boil over, a strange sense of calm settled in its place. I watched Julian's hand as he gripped the side of the podium. There it was again, the slight, almost imperceptible twitch. The ALS was a silent auditor, and it had already started its inspection of his arrogant frame. He thought he was starting a new chapter with a trophy wife, but he was actually walking into a storm he had no equipment to survive. He was trading a partner who could weather any winter for a flower that would wither at the first sign of frost. I tucked my hands into my pockets, feeling the crinkle of the medical report I still carried. I didn't need to make a scene. I didn't need to scream. Julian had already signed his own eviction notice from the world of the healthy and the powerful. He just didn't know it yet. I turned my back on the stage, on the diamond, and on the man I no longer recognized. As I walked out of the ballroom, the cool night air of Beverly Hills hit my face, and for the first time in years, I felt a spark of something other than duty. I felt the cold, sharp edge of a plan forming. If Julian wanted a life without me, I would give him exactly that. A life where he had everything he thought he wanted, and absolutely nothing that he actually needed. The game was no longer about saving him, it was about saving myself. The morning after the gala, the California sun bled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, but it brought no warmth. The Star of Chicago was still burned into my retinas, a cold, glittering reminder that a decade of my life had been appraised and sold for the price of a mistress's smile. I was sitting at the kitchen island, a cup of black coffee cooling in my hands, when the private elevator chimed. I didn't need to look up to know who it was. The sharp, rhythmic clicking of Italian heels on the marble was as distinctive as a rattlesnake's warning. It was Beatrice, my mother-in-law, a woman who treated social standing like a religion and viewed me as nothing more than the hired help who happened to marry into the family. She didn't offer a greeting. She simply walked into the room, her Chanel suit impeccably pressed, and looked around the penthouse with a disdainful sniff, as if the very air I breathed was beneath her. "You look terrible, Clara," she began, dropping her Hermes bag onto the counter I had spent 3 months sourcing from a quarry in Italy. But then again, neglect has always been your signature style, hasn't it? I didn't rise to the bait. I had spent 10 years navigating the treacherous waters of the Julian-Beatrice alliance, and I knew that every word out of her mouth was a calculated strike, designed to find a crack in my foundation. I simply set my coffee down and looked at her. I assume you didn't come here to discuss my wardrobe, Beatrice. What do you want? She let out a soft, sharp laugh, the kind that never reaches the eyes. What I want is for this embarrassing spectacle to end. Julian told me about the divorce papers. He also told me about your behavior at the gala last night, standing in the corner like a dark cloud while he tried to celebrate his achievements. It's unseemly, Clara. It's beneath the J&C name. The sheer audacity of her words felt like a physical weight. I thought of the countless holidays I had spent organizing Beatrice's charity auctions, the hours I'd spent listening to her complain about the low-class neighbors, and the way I had quietly diverted company funds to pay off her mounting gambling debts at the country club to keep her reputation intact. I had been her protector, just as I had been Julian's. His achievements? I asked, my voice dangerously low. You know as well as I do who drew every line of those contracts, Beatrice. You know who kept this family from bankruptcy when Julian's creative impulses nearly sank us 5 years ago. Beatrice waved a manicured hand as if shooing away a fly. A man needs a wife, Clara, not a business manager. If you had spent half as much time in the bedroom as you did in the drafting room, perhaps Julian wouldn't have been forced to seek outside inspiration. A man has needs, and you have become as cold and sterile as one of your buildings. This was the red flag I had ignored for far too long. The deep-seated belief that my labor was a liability, and my husband's infidelity was my own failure. Beatrice stepped closer, her perfume cloying and suffocating. The press is already starting to sniff around. They're calling you the discarded architect. It makes Julian look like a villain, and more importantly, it makes the family look unstable. I've spoken with Julian, and we've reached a decision. You are to issue a public statement claiming the split was amicable. You will also meet with Tiffany for lunch, publicly, and give her your blessing. You will apologize for making things difficult for them. In exchange, I will ensure Julian doesn't fight you on the minor assets. I felt a hollow laugh bubbling up in my chest, but it died before it reached my lips. She wanted me to apologize to the woman wearing my dream on her finger? She wanted me to pave the way for my own erasure just to save the family face. In that moment, the last thread of loyalty I held for the J&C legacy snapped. I looked at Beatrice and realized she didn't see a human being in front of her. She saw a structural defect that needed to be plastered over. She represented everything that had allowed Julian to become the monster he was. A culture of entitlement that fed on the sacrifices of useful women like me. You want an apology? I asked, standing up slowly. My height was one of the few things Beatrice couldn't patronize. You want me to bless the woman who is currently spending the capital I earned while your son is one tremor away from a wheelchair? Beatrice's eyes narrowed, a flicker of genuine confusion crossing her face at the mention of the wheelchair. What on earth are you talking about? Julian is in the prime of his life. He's vibrant. He's free. I realized then that Julian hadn't told her about the ALS. He was too proud, too obsessed with his image of the invincible King of Chicago, to admit he was dying. He was hiding his decay from his own mother, just as he was hiding his betrayal from the world. I opened my mouth to tell her the truth, to watch the blood drain from her face as she realized her vibrant son was a walking ghost. But I stopped. If I told her, I would be offering her the chance to prepare, to spin the narrative, to turn Julian into a tragic hero and me into the bitter wife who abandoned a sick man. Nothing, Beatrice, I said, my voice as cold as the marble under my feet. I'm talking about the fact that I am done being the foundation for a family that is built on sand. You want a public statement? You'll get one. But it won't be an apology. And as for Tiffany, she's welcome to Julian. She's welcome to his name, his debt, and his future. I hope she's a better nurse than she is a mistress, because she's going to need those skills much sooner than she thinks. Beatrice looked at me as if I had suddenly started speaking a foreign language. You're being hysterical, Clara. It's unbecoming. Think about your legacy. I walked to the elevator and pressed the button, the chime ringing out like a bell for the end of a round. My legacy isn't this apartment, Beatrice. It isn't even the J&C name. My legacy is my mind. And that is the one thing you and Julian can't take in the divorce. As the doors closed on her indignant face, I felt a strange, analytical peace. I was officially alone, and for the first time in 10 years, that felt like an advantage. The legal blow came 3 days later, delivered not by a process server, but by Julian himself in our glass-walled boardroom at the firm. He sat there, flanked by 2 shark-like attorneys, looking more like a stranger than the man I had shared a bed with for a decade. He didn't look sick today. The adrenaline of his own perceived brilliance seemed to have masked the tremors for a while. On the polished oak table sat a manila envelope. "I wasn't going to do this, Clara," he said, his voice dripping with a rehearsed, sorrowful disappointment that made my skin crawl. "I was going to let you walk away with your dignity, but Beatrice told me about your threats. If you want to play dirty, we can play dirty." He slid the envelope toward me. Inside were grainy, long-lens photographs of me entering a side suite at the Peninsula Beverly Hills at 2 in the morning, followed closely by Dr. Harrison. Dr. Marcus Harrison, Julian's lead attorney chimed in, leaning forward with a predatory smile. "A prominent cardiologist, a family friend, and apparently your late-night companion for the last 6 months. My client has been enduring the coldness of this marriage while you were seeking comfort in hotel rooms. We have the logs, Clara. We have the dates." I stared at the photos, my mind flashing back to that night 6 months ago. The air in that hotel suite had smelled of expensive scotch and the copper tang of fear. Mr. Sterling, the billionaire developer who held the keys to our entire firm's expansion, had collapsed during our final, high-stakes negotiation. He had a history of heart issues and a pathological fear of the press finding out. I hadn't called 911 because it would have ended the deal and Sterling's career. I had called Harrison, my closest friend from college, to perform an off-the-books miracle. I had stayed by Sterling's side until dawn, holding his hand, while Harrison stabilized him. Because of that night, Julian got the signature on the $10 million Pacific Heights contract the next morning. "You're accusing me of infidelity?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm, the irony of the situation sitting like a block of ice in my chest. Julian leaned back, crossing his arms over his chest, his face a mask of smug satisfaction. "The photos don't lie, Clara. You've been using work as a cover for your little trysts with the good doctor. It explains why you were always too tired for your husband, doesn't it? Why you were always at the office until 4 a.m.? He was gaslighting me with the very hours I had spent saving his empire from the brink of collapse. He knew Sterling's health was a trade secret. He knew I couldn't defend myself without breaking a non-disclosure agreement that carried a $5 million penalty. He wasn't just trying to win the divorce. He was trying to bankrupt my soul." "Is this really the path you want to take, Julian?" I asked, looking him directly in the eye. I searched for a flicker of shame, a hint of the man who used to share ramen with me in Chicago. But there was nothing left but a shallow, hungry ego. "You're using the night I secured the Sterling contract to paint me as a cheat? The night I literally saved the roof over your head?" Julian let out a short, bark-like laugh. "Sterling? Please. I closed that deal because I'm a closer, Clara. Don't try to take credit for my talent just because you were out playing house with a cardiologist. In California, infidelity doesn't affect the assets, but it certainly affects the morality clauses in our partnership agreement. I'm moving to have you removed from J&C Architecture immediately. No one wants a lead architect whose private life is a tabloid scandal." The intellectual cruelty of it was almost impressive. He had waited until he had the Star of Chicago on Tiffany's finger and a smear campaign ready for me before he made his final move to seize the firm. He wanted to strip me of the one thing I had left, my professional identity. He thought he had trapped me between a $5 million NDA and a character assassination. But Julian had made a fatal error, the kind of structural mistake I had spent 10 years catching for him. He assumed I was still playing by the rules of the marriage we used to have. He assumed I was still trying to protect him. "I see," I said, sliding the photos back across the table. I didn't defend myself. I didn't mention Sterling. I didn't even mention that Harrison was gay and had been with his partner for 15 years. A fact Julian knew perfectly well, but chose to ignore for the sake of his narrative. "If this is the story you want to tell the board, Julian, then tell it. But remember, a building is only as strong as its foundation. You've spent the last hour jackhammering yours." Julian's lawyer scoffed, but I saw it again. A sudden, sharp jerk in Julian's left shoulder, followed by him quickly grabbing the edge of the table to steady himself. The ALS wasn't waiting for the legal proceedings to finish. It was moving into the structural beams of his pride. As I walked out of that boardroom, my heart wasn't breaking. It was hardening into a diamond. I took the elevator down to the lobby and pulled out my phone. I didn't call a divorce lawyer. I called my contact at the forensic accounting firm I'd quietly retained the moment I saw the receipt for that ring. Julian thought he was the one holding the receipts, but he had been sloppy. He had been so busy building a lie about my affair that he hadn't noticed the trail of breadcrumbs he'd left while siphoning company funds into Tiffany's offshore accounts. He wanted to talk about morality? We would talk about morality. But we would do it in the language of wire transfers and embezzlement. He was trying to frame me for a heartthrob, while I was preparing to bury him in his own greed. I didn't go home to cry. Tears are for those who still have something to lose, and Julian had already stripped me of my illusions. Instead, I went to my home office, a room that smelled of cedar and old blueprints, and I traded my charcoal blazer for an oversized cashmere sweater. I sat in the glow of 3 monitors, the blue light reflecting off my glasses like a digital war paint. Julian had called me clinical and dry. Fine. If he wanted a woman who operated like a machine, I would show him exactly how efficient a machine could be when its primary objective was survival. For 10 years, I had been the silent architect of our firm's success, but tonight, I was the forensic investigator of its downfall. I wasn't just looking for money. I was looking for the structural cracks Julian had created while he was busy playing invincible mogul with a mistress half his age. J&C architecture wasn't just a business to me. It was a complex organism I had programmed myself. Every line of credit, every vendor payment, and every offshore architectural consultation had my digital fingerprints on it. Julian thought he was clever by changing his personal passwords, but he had forgotten that I was the one who set up the firm's internal server protocols 5 years ago. I began to peel back the layers of our Pacific Heights project, the very deal I had saved by sitting in a hotel room with a dying billionaire and a cardiologist. As I dived into the ledgers, the smell of betrayal became nauseatingly clear. Julian hadn't just used his personal savings for Tiffany. He had been siphoning operational capital, money meant for payroll, insurance, and raw materials, into a shell company registered in Delaware under the name T-Star Acquisitions. It was a classic amateur move. He was treating the firm's treasury like his personal piggy bank to fund a lifestyle he couldn't actually afford. The deeper I dug, the more the Star of Chicago began to look like a millstone around his neck. The receipt wasn't just for a diamond. It was a record of embezzlement. He had authorized a $1.2 million payment for structural consulting to a firm that didn't exist, on the same day the jeweler's invoice was generated. My hands were steady as I downloaded the wire transfer records. I felt a cold, intellectual satisfaction. In the eyes of the law, and especially in the eyes of our high-stakes investors, this wasn't just a messy divorce anymore. This was a breach of fiduciary duty. Julian had compromised the integrity of the firm to buy a shiny toy for a girl who wouldn't be able to tell a floor plan from a fashion magazine. He thought he was framing me for an affair to protect his morality clause, but he was handing me the keys to his entire kingdom on a silver platter of fraud. To keep him off the scent, I spent the following week playing the role of the discarded wife to perfection. I arrived at the office with my hair slightly unkempt and my eyes intentionally bare of makeup, looking like a woman who was slowly unraveling under the weight of his accusations. I let Julian see me packing small, personal items into cardboard boxes: a ceramic pen holder from Chicago, a framed photo of our first office. I even let a few fake tears well up when he walked past my desk with Tiffany on his arm, her heels clicking a triumphant rhythm on the floor I had designed. "Still here, Clara?" he'd sneer, his voice loud enough for the junior architects to hear. "I thought you'd be halfway to Harrison's clinic by now. Don't forget to take the stapler." Tiffany would just giggle, leaning into him, her Star of Chicago diamond flashing like a taunt in the fluorescent light. It was a dangerous game of masked theater. Every time Julian insulted me, he felt more powerful, more invincible, and consequently, more careless. He stopped checking the internal logs. He started taking 3 martini lunches with Tiffany on the company card, leaving his laptop unlocked on his desk. One afternoon, while they were out at a tasting for their upcoming engagement party, I walked into his office. I didn't need a key. He'd become so arrogant he didn't even bother to close the door. In 10 minutes, I had mirrored his hard drive. I found everything. The emails to Tiffany promising her a clean break from me, the messages to his mother about how they would starve me out of the settlement, and most importantly, the draft of his plan to sell my proprietary architectural software to a competitor to cover the hole he'd dug in the company's accounts. He called me a failure as a wife, but he was failing as a man in real time. I watched him through the glass partition later that day. He was trying to sign a document, but his fingers wouldn't close properly around the pen. He looked frustrated, angry, shaking his hand as if it had simply fallen asleep. He didn't know that his invincibility was a lie being told by his own nervous system. He was a man building a glass house, while the ground was already liquefying beneath him. I sat back in my chair, sipping a lukewarm coffee, and felt a surge of something that wasn't quite pity, but wasn't quite hate either. It was the feeling an architect gets when they see a building that is doomed to fail. Not because the materials were bad, but because the foundation was a lie. By the end of the week, I had 3 encrypted drives filled with the receipts. I had a detailed map of his fraud, a recording of his mother admitting to their plan to smear my name, and a clear timeline of his siphoning. I was no longer the woman crying in the dark penthouse. I was a strategist holding a royal flush, while Julian was still trying to figure out the rules of the game. He thought he was giving Tiffany the world, but he was actually giving her a front-row seat to his bankruptcy. I sent a single, one-line email to my lawyer. "I have the structural flaws. It's time to pull the permits." The air at the Pelican Hill Resort was cloying, a mixture of expensive sea salt candles and the desperate scent of old money trying to stay relevant. This was Julian's grand gesture, an engagement party disguised as a high society fundraiser designed to cement his status as California's most eligible and most successful newly single mogul. I stood on the periphery of the terrace, partially obscured by a towering topiary, watching the theater unfold. I wasn't wearing charcoal today. I had chosen a deep midnight blue gown that blended into the shadows of the evening. To the elite crowd sipping vintage Krug, I was just a ghost, the ex-wife who had supposedly been cast aside for a younger, more vibrant Muse. They looked at me with a pity that tasted like ash, entirely unaware that I was the only person in this garden who knew that the man of the hour was a house of cards leaning into a hurricane. Julian was center stage, glowing under the warm amber spotlights I had once helped him select for his public appearances. He looked radiant, but to my trained eye, the facade was cracking. His laugh was a pitch too high, and his movements were stiff, as if he were fighting a silent war with his own muscles, just to stay upright. Beside him, Tiffany was a vision in white silk, her youth draped over her like a stolen cloak. She was laughing at something an investor said, her left hand constantly moving, tilting her wrist so the star of Chicago would catch every stray beam of light. Each flash of that diamond was a needle in my heart. That stone was never meant for a terrace in Newport Beach. It was meant to be the quiet victory of two kids from a leaky apartment who had survived the cold together. Seeing it on her finger, used as a prop for a social climbing exercise, was the final structural failure of my love for him. The foundation didn't just crack, it turned to dust. The music swelled, a live string quartet playing a modernized version of something classical, and the crowd hushed. Julian took Tiffany's hand, leading her to the center of the marble rotunda. This was it. The public surprise proposal that everyone already knew was coming. As he began to speak, his voice amplified by the discreet lapel mic, he spoke of new beginnings and finding the soul that finally understands the artist's heart. It was a beautifully scripted lie, a slap in the face to the 10 years I had spent being his hands, his brain, and his conscience. I watched his right leg give a subtle, violent twitch as he prepared to go down on one knee. For a terrifying second, I thought he might collapse right there on the marble, but his pride held him together with a strength that was almost macabre. He sank down, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, looking less like a romantic lead and more like a marionette with tangled strings. "Tiffany," he said, his voice trembling. The crowd thought it was emotion, but I knew it was the ALS clawing at his throat. "Will you make me the happiest man in the world?" He opened the velvet box, and the star of Chicago shrieked with light. The audience let out a collective, rehearsed gasp. Tiffany's surprise was Emmy-worthy, her hands flying to her face, her eyes welling with tears that had likely been practiced in her vanity mirror for hours. She said yes, of course, and as Julian struggled to slide the ring onto her finger, I saw his entire arm shake. He had to use his other hand to steady it, a clumsy, fumbling motion that ruined the grace of the moment. I looked at Beatrice, standing in the front row, her face a mask of triumphant arrogance as she looked toward me, her eyes saying, "See? You were nothing but a stepping stone." I didn't flinch. I just felt a cold, crystalline clarity. They had their moment. They had their diamond. Now they would have the consequences. I reached into my small evening clutch and pulled out my phone. The screen's glow felt honest in this world of artificial light. I opened the draft I had prepared, a massive, encrypted file addressed to the senior partner of our most conservative investment group and the district attorney's office for financial crimes. It contained every wire transfer, every shell company T-Star acquisitions record, and the digital trail of the stolen capital used to buy that very ring. It also included a detailed statement from Dr. Harrison, not about an affair, but about the medical necessity of the night Julian had used to smear my name, backed by a letter from Mr. Sterling himself, who was more than happy to crush Julian for trying to use his private health crisis as a legal weapon. I looked at Julian one last time as he stood up, leaning heavily on Tiffany just to stay balanced. He looked happy. He looked like he had won. I hit send. The digital pulse left my phone and entered the atmosphere, a silent strike that would land within the hour. By tomorrow morning, the forensic auditors would be at the J&C offices. By tomorrow night, the investors would be pulling their lines of credit. Julian had wanted a life without my clinical interference, and he was about to get it. He was about to find out that when you remove the load-bearing wall, the roof doesn't stay up just because you wish it to. I turned away from the cheers and the champagne, walking toward the valet stand without looking back. The star of Chicago was gone, but for the first time in a decade, I felt like the air I was breathing actually belonged to me. I was no longer the architect of his dreams. I was the architect of my own freedom. He gave her the ring we promised over ramen noodles 10 years ago. He calls me a cheater to hide his own shame. Do you think a man like that deserves a second chance? Or should I let the law and his own failing body teach him a lesson? Like this video and comment "Justice" if you want to see how the tables turn. The morning after the engagement party didn't bring the triumphant headlines Julian had expected. Instead, it brought a cold, clinical silence that began at 8 a.m. when the primary servers at J&C Architecture were remotely locked by the forensic audit team I had authorized. I watched from my home office, monitoring the frantic pings from the office Slack channels as the golden boy of Chicago realized his kingdom was no longer responding to his touch. By noon, the emergency board meeting was called. Julian, still riding the high of his public proposal and likely nursing a champagne hangover, marched into the boardroom with the misplaced confidence of a man who thought he had already won. He was wearing a bespoke suit and a smirk, unaware that the chair at the head of the table was no longer his to sit in. I wasn't in the room physically. I didn't need to be. I was a presence in the data, a ghost in the ledgers that were currently being projected onto the wall for the senior partners to see. Arthur, our lead investor, and a man who valued a balanced sheet more than his own family, didn't even look up when Julian entered. "Sit down, Julian," Arthur said, his voice flat and devoid of its usual paternal warmth. Julian laughed, a sharp, nervous sound that echoed off the glass walls. "Arthur, what's with the drama? If this is about the star of Chicago being a company expense, I was going to explain the marketing angle." Arthur cut him off with a single raised hand. "It's not just the ring, Julian. It's the Delaware Shell Company. It's the siphoning of the Sterling Project's contingency fund. It's the fact that your wife, the woman you've spent the last month trying to bankrupt, is the only reason this firm hasn't been indicted for fraud already." The color drained from Julian's face so quickly it was as if a plug had been pulled. He tried to speak, to weave one of those charismatic spells that had served him for a decade, but the words wouldn't come. And then, the true collapse began. Not the financial one, but the physical one. He tried to stand, to dominate the room with his height, but his right leg buckled as if the bone had suddenly turned to glass. He grabbed the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning white as he fought to stay upright, but the tremors were no longer a secret. They were a violent, visible betrayal of his own body. His hand jerked, sweeping a glass of water off the table. The sound of it shattering on the floor was the only thing heard in the room as Julian sank back into his chair, his breathing ragged and his face twisted in a mixture of rage and terror. "What is this?" Julian hissed, his voice slurring slightly, the ALS finally claiming the muscles of his throat. "Clara, she's behind this. She's lying. She's the one, with Harrison." Arthur didn't even blink. "We have Dr. Harrison's statement, Julian. We also have a letter from Mr. Sterling. You didn't just betray your wife. You betrayed the firm's most valuable client by trying to use his health as a weapon in a divorce. You're a liability, Julian. Not just a moral one, but a physical and financial one. As of 10 minutes ago, the board has voted to remove you as CEO. Your assets are frozen pending the full audit." The door to the boardroom burst open then, and Tiffany marched in, looking like a page out of a fashion magazine, her Star of Chicago diamond flashing aggressively. She didn't go to Julian's side. She didn't ask if he was okay as he sat there, gray-faced and trembling. She went straight for the table. "Julian, what is going on? My card was declined at the boutique. My Hermes bag. They wouldn't let me take it." She looked around the room, her eyes landing on the grim faces of the investors. Why is everyone looking at him like that? Julian, fix this. You said I was the queen now. Julian looked up at her, his eyes pleading, a silent cry for the devotion he had traded my life for. He reached out a shaking hand toward her, but Tiffany recoiled as if he were contagious. She saw the broken glass. She saw the way his mouth was beginning to droop on one side. And most importantly, she heard the word frozen. The vibrant muse who made him feel alive evaporated in an instant, replaced by a cold, calculating woman who realized she had hitched her wagon to a falling star. "You're broke?" she whispered, the horror in her voice genuine. "And you're sick? You lied to me, Julian. You told me you were the one who ran this place. You told me she was just the help." She didn't stay to help him up. She didn't offer a hand as he struggled to breathe. She turned on her heel, her silk dress rustling with an angry, sharp sound, and walked out of the room, her mind already calculating the resale value of the ring on her finger. Julian sat in the ruins of his own making, the silence of the boardroom heavier than the Chicago winter we had once survived together. He had built his life on the idea that he was the architect and I was the material. But now he was finding out the truth. Without the foundation, the skyscraper is just a pile of rubble waiting for the wind to blow it away. I watched the security footage from my home office, my face as expressionless as the buildings I designed. The trap had snapped shut, and the man inside it was finally realizing that the only person who would have stayed to help him through the dark was the one he had pushed into the light to be executed. The walls of the Malibu penthouse, once a testament to our shared ascent, had become a cold, hollow canyon. It was midnight when my phone vibrated on the nightstand, the screen illuminating the dark room with a name I had spent weeks trying to scrub from my soul. I didn't answer the first 3 times. I sat in the silence of my new, modest apartment, a space filled with the scent of fresh blueprints and autonomy, and watched the device dance across the wood. On the 4th attempt, something told me to pick up. Maybe it was the architect in me, wanting to hear the final groan of a collapsing structure. When I pressed the phone to my ear, I didn't hear the voice of the man who had stood in the boardroom 3 weeks ago. I heard a wet, ragged breathing, punctuated by the clink of glass against marble. "Clara, please," he whispered, the words slurring and catching in his throat like gravel. The ALS was no longer a silent auditor. It had become the primary tenant of his body. "I'm on the floor, Clara. I can't. My legs won't. I can't get up." I sat on the edge of my bed, my heart a steady, rhythmic beat against the frantic chaos of his voice. I could picture him exactly, lying on the white Carrara marble he had insisted on, surrounded by the shadows of a home he had emptied of warmth. "Where is Tiffany, Julian?" I asked, my voice as level as a horizon line. There was a long, jagged silence, followed by a sob that sounded like it cost him a piece of his lungs. "Gone," he choked out. "She took the bags. She took the jewelry. She even took the Star of Chicago. She said she couldn't be a nurse to a broke cripple. She left me here in the dark, Clara. She didn't even leave the lights on." The irony was so sharp it was almost poetic. He had traded 10 years of structural integrity for a facade made of glitter, and the moment the storm hit, the glitter had washed away, leaving him in the mud. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and to my surprise, I actually meant it. Not because I felt pity for him, but because it was a tragedy of such monumental stupidity. "You gave her the ring we promised over ramen noodles, Julian. You gave her the capital I earned with my blood and my brain. You told the world I was a failure as a wife, while I was holding the very diagnosis that explained why your hand was shaking. Did you really think her love was built on anything other than the assets you stole from me?" Julian let out a wail, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. "I made a mistake. I was scared. I thought if I had her, I was still young. I was still strong. Clara, I love you. I've always loved you. Please, come get me. You're the only one who knows the doctors. You're the only one who can save the firm. I'll give it all back. Just don't leave me here like this." The desperation in his voice was a physical weight, but it didn't move me. I thought about the night of the gala, the way he had looked at Tiffany with that smug, possessive pride, while I stood in the back of the room like a discarded sketch. I thought about Beatrice and her apology lunch. I thought about the photos of me and Harrison he had used to try and ruin my career. He wasn't calling me because he loved me. He was calling me because I was the only person on Earth capable of fixing the disaster he had made. He wanted his architect back to repair the foundation he had dynamited himself. "You're not calling me because you love me, Julian," I said, my voice gaining a cold, crystalline edge. "You're calling me because the light is gone, and you're afraid to be alone with the man you've become. You're calling me because your trophy bride found out you're a liability, and she doesn't do liability. You think you can just press undo on a decade of betrayal because you're having a bad night on a marble floor? Clara, please. I can't breathe well. I'm scared," he whimpered. I looked out my window at the city lights of Los Angeles, a city I was currently redesigning, one project at a time. I felt a strange, detached peace. The woman who would have rushed to that penthouse, who would have carried him to the car and stayed by his side through every hospital visit, had died the moment he tossed those divorce papers on the counter. Julian had murdered her, and now he was asking the ghost for a favor. "I know you're scared, Julian. I was scared too. I was scared for you, and I was scared for us. But you made your choice. You chose the ring, you chose the lie, and you chose the girl who only loved your bank account. I am not a prize you get to reclaim now that you've lost everything else. I am not a consolation prize for your failure." The silence on the other end of the line was heavy, broken only by his shallow, labored gasps. He knew I was right. He knew that the Star of Chicago was likely already sitting in a pawn shop or being sold to a private buyer in the hills, and that the woman who wore it was already looking for her next mogul. He was alone in the monument of his own ego, and for the first time in his life, he was seeing the blueprints of his soul for what they really were: empty. "I'll call an ambulance for you, Julian," I said, "because I'm not a monster. But don't call this number again. The firm is gone, the penthouse is being foreclosed on, and the us you're looking for doesn't exist anymore. You wanted to be free. Now, you're the freest man in California. Enjoy the silence." I hung up the phone before he could reply. I didn't cry. I didn't even feel angry. I just felt the immense relief of a structure that had finally finished falling. I went to my desk, picked up my drafting pen, and began to work on the designs for a new library in Cambridge. My life was no longer about fixing Julian's mistakes. It was about building something that would actually last. The courthouse in downtown Los Angeles didn't feel like a hall of justice that morning. It felt like a surgical theater. The air was sterile and thin, smelling of floor wax and the cold finality of law. I stood in the corridor, dressed in a sharp, tailored navy suit, the color of a deep ocean, waiting for the doors of Department 42 to open. I wasn't the woman who had shared ramen noodles in Chicago, nor was I the clinical wife who had been pushed into the shadows of her own firm. I was the architect of this moment. I had calculated the loads, tested the stress points, and now I was here to watch the structure of Julian's lies finally collapse under the weight of the truth. When Julian was rolled into the hallway by a court-appointed assistant, the silence around him was deafening. He was in a motorized wheelchair now, his frame once so imposing and vibrant, now withered like a tree struck by a sudden, cruel frost. His suit, a custom Italian silk that cost more than our first car, hung off his shoulders in mocking folds. There was no Tiffany by his side. There was no Beatrice whispering poison into his ear. He looked small, not just physically, but spiritually. He looked like a man who had finally realized that when you burn every bridge behind you, you shouldn't be surprised when you find yourself stranded on a very small, very lonely island. His eyes met mine, and for a fleeting second, I saw the ghost of the man I had loved. But that ghost was quickly replaced by a flicker of the same old arrogance, now twisted into a desperate, slurred plea. Inside the courtroom, the proceedings were swift and brutal. My legal team didn't lead with my broken heart. They led with the ledgers. We presented the digital trail of T-Star acquisitions, the shell company Julian had used to siphon nearly $3 million of firm capital to fund his lifestyle with Tiffany and purchase the Star of Chicago. We presented the sworn testimony from our forensic auditors and the letter from Mr. Sterling, detailing how Julian had attempted to use confidential medical information as a weapon in a personal dispute. But the killing blow, the structural failure he never saw coming, was the very document he had tossed on our kitchen island on our 10th anniversary. Your Honor, my attorney stated, his voice echoing with a calm authority. On the night of their anniversary, Mr. J and C Architecture voluntarily served my client with a divorce petition in which he explicitly stated, and I quote, "I am leaving with nothing but my freedom and the woman I love. I waive all claims to our shared marital assets and the firm's equity in exchange for a swift dissolution." At the time, he believed he was being generous because he had already secretly stolen the firm's capital. He thought he was leaving my client with a hollowed-out shell. The judge leaned forward, her eyes scanning the original petition. Julian tried to speak, his hand jerking violently against the armrest of his wheelchair, but only a strained, unintelligible sound came out. His lawyer tried to argue that Julian was not of sound mind due to his emerging condition, but I had the receipts for that too. Emails from the very same week where Julian was masterfully orchestrating the fraud, proving his cognitive faculties were perfectly intact when he chose to sign his life away. The law does not protect those who seek to use it as a shield for their own corruption, the judge said, her voice like a gavel strike. Mr. J and C Architecture, you chose to walk away with nothing to pursue a life outside this marriage. This court will hold you to that choice. Furthermore, due to the documented breach of fiduciary duty and the embezzlement of company funds, your remaining minority shares in J and C Architecture are hereby forfeited to the firm to cover the losses and legal fees incurred by the petitioner. In an instant, the empire was mine. Not because I had won a fight, but because I had simply reclaimed what I had built while Julian was busy trying to destroy it. I looked over at him as the bailiff began to clear the room. He was staring at his shaking hands, the reality of his situation finally settling in. He had no firm. He had no money. He had no Tiffany. She had been spotted in Cabo with a tech heir 2 days after she sold the Star of Chicago to a private collector. He didn't even have his health. He had traded everything for a dream that had turned out to be a cheap plastic imitation. As I gathered my files, I walked past him one last time. He looked up, his eyes watering, a single tear tracking down his sunken cheek. "Clara," he rasped, the word barely a whisper. I stopped, but I didn't lean down. I didn't offer the comfort he had so casually denied me for years. "You told me I was as exciting as a blueprint, Julian," I said, my voice steady and devoid of malice. "But you forgot the most important thing about a blueprint. It's the only thing that tells you how to survive the storm. You threw away the map, and now you're lost. I can't build a path back for you this time." I walked out of that courtroom and into the bright, uncompromising California sun. The weight that had been on my chest for 10 years, the weight of his ego, his secrets, and my own silent sacrifices, was gone. I felt light. I felt powerful. I felt like an architect who had just cleared the rubble of a collapsed building and finally had a clean plot of land to build something new, something honest, something that wouldn't fall. The crisp, intellectual air of Cambridge, Massachusetts, was a world away from the humid, ego-driven boardrooms of Los Angeles. 1 year had passed since the day the courthouse doors swung shut on the ruins of my old life, and today, the only structure I was focused on was the one being honored. I stood in the hallowed halls of Harvard's Graduate School of Design, the scent of aged paper and fresh coffee a far more honest perfume than the expensive lilies of my former penthouse. I was no longer the woman hidden in the shadows of a great man. I was Clara, the architect of the year, a visiting professor, and the owner of a firm that had not only survived a scandal, but had become the gold standard for ethical, visionary design. As I adjusted the lapel of my cream-colored blazer, I caught my reflection in the glass of a display case featuring my latest project, the New England Sustainability Center. My eyes were clear, my posture was a testament to structural integrity, and for the first time in a decade, my heart didn't feel like it was under a heavy load. I had spent the year rebuilding, not just buildings, but myself. I had taken the scattered fragments of my identity and forged something stronger, something that didn't require someone else's permission to exist. The firm, now simply called Foundations, was thriving. Investors who had once looked at me with pity were now clamoring for a seat at my table. They had realized what Julian never could. You can buy a diamond, and you can buy a facade, but you cannot buy the mind that knows how to make them stand. The gala following my lecture was filled with the brightest minds in the industry. I moved through the room with a serene confidence, sharing a laugh with Dr. Harrison, who had stayed by my side as a steadfast friend and partner in integrity. He had been the one to encourage me to leave California, to bring my genius to a place that valued substance over spectacle. As we spoke about an upcoming project in Tokyo, my gaze drifted toward the back of the auditorium, near the shadows of the arched exit. There, amidst the crowd of vibrant, ambitious students and world-renowned architects, sat a figure in a motorized wheelchair. He was gnarled, his frame so diminished that he looked like a child lost in an oversized suit. Julian. I had heard through the grapevine that he was living in a modest facility, supported by the meager state disability checks he had once mocked. Tiffany was long gone, of course. The star of Chicago had been sold to pay off her own mounting debts before she vanished into the nightlife of Miami, looking for a new victim. Beatrice, too, had disappeared from the social scene, her pride unable to survive the public disgrace of her son's fraud. Julian had come here, to this ceremony, perhaps as a final act of masochism, or a desperate search for the light he had so casually extinguished. I walked toward him, not out of pity, but for the finality of it. As Harrison waited a respectful distance away, I stood before the man I had once shared ramen noodles with in a leaky Chicago apartment. His eyes, once bright with an arrogance that mimicked brilliance, were now clouded with a profound, soul-crushing regret. He struggled to lift his head, his breathing aided by a quiet, rhythmic hum of a machine. "Clara," he rasped, the word a struggle, a ghost of a sound. I didn't say anything at first. I let the silence sit between us, a silence that wasn't heavy or angry, but simply empty. "I saw the award," he continued, his voice slurring. "You were always the best of us." He paused, his shaking hand twitching against the joystick of his chair. If I had stayed, would you have been there? Until the end?" I looked at him, and I didn't see a monster. I just saw a man who had chosen a reflection in a mirror over the person standing right next to him. "Yes, Julian," I said, my voice as steady as the granite of the building around us. "I would have been your strength when yours failed. I would have been your voice when you lost yours. I would have stayed until the very last breath, not because of the firm or the money, but because I believed in the promise we made in that cold apartment 10 years ago. I was ready to be your foundation, Julian, but you decided that a foundation was too boring, too clinical. You chose to tear down the only house that would have ever sheltered you." A single, slow tear rolled down his cheek, disappearing into the collar of his shirt. He had no defense, no charismatic lie left to tell. He had spent his life building on sand, and now the tide had come in. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I know you are," I replied softly. "But sorry is just a word. Integrity is an action. I've spent the last year building a life that doesn't have room for ghosts." I leaned down slightly, not to touch him, but to look him in the eye one last time. "I hope you find peace, Julian, but you'll have to find it within yourself. I'm no longer the architect of your world." I turned away then, my heels clicking a firm, decisive rhythm on the polished floor. I walked back to Harrison, who offered me a warm, knowing smile. As we walked out of the auditorium and into the crisp Boston night, The stars above felt closer and brighter than they ever had in Malibu. I had protected my legacy, I had secured my justice, and I had reclaimed my soul. The best revenge wasn't the lawsuit or the forfeited shares. It was the fact that I was happy, I was whole, and I was just getting started. I looked up at the moon, a perfect white circle against the dark sky, and realized that I didn't need the star of Chicago to shine. I was my own light. And as we headed toward a new chapter, I knew that the buildings I would create from now on would be built on the only thing that truly lasts: the truth. I walked away that day, not with anger, but with peace. I saved a life, built an empire, and finally, I found a love that doesn't require me to shrink myself. What would you have done in my shoes? Would you have stayed to care for him, or would you walk away like I did? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of strength and rebirth. Thank you for being part of my journey.